Imagine a world where justice was not decided in courtrooms filled with lawyers, but in dark stone chambers where the sound of cracking bones replaced the sound of a judge's gavel. Where the truth was not discovered through evidence or testimony, but torn from the human body with iron, rope, and fire. This world was not a nightmare born of fiction. It was Europe in the Middle Ages, and its machinery of suffering was not an accident of barbarism, but a carefully constructed system. Sanctioned by law, blessed by religion, and perfected over centuries. And it all began with a single papal decree. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued a document called Ad Extirpanda. At first glance, it was written in the polished Latin of church authority. But its meaning was brutally clear. Torture could be used legally to extract confessions from suspected heretics, as long as it did not cost life or limb. That phrase, almost merciful in appearance, was nothing more than a loophole. Skilled torturers quickly learned how to keep a body alive while reducing the soul to rubble. With a stroke of the papal pen, Europe shifted from a world where torture was an irregular brutality into one where it was an institutional tool of control. To understand how shocking this change was, we need to look back. For centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe lived in a patchwork of legal traditions. Roman law had allowed torture, but mostly against slaves and foreigners. Ordinary citizens had protection. Germanic tribes, who filled the vacuum of Rome's collapse, relied instead on trial by ordeal, walking over hot iron, plunging a hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a river to see if God would save the innocent. Justice was crude, but it avoided the calculated cruelty of organized torture. For nearly 500 years, these two traditions coexisted uneasily. Then came the 11th and 12th centuries, an age of revival. Europe's rulers were consolidating power. Universities in Bologna and Padua rediscovered Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the great Roman legal code. Inside it, scholars found a detailed framework for state authority, including provisions for torture. At the same time, the Crusades brought European knights and clerics into contact with Byzantine and Islamic law, where systematic punishment and interrogation were already part of governance. Slowly, the idea that torture could be justified crept back into the European legal imagination. The real turning point came with Frederick Tubby of Sicily. In 1231, he issued the Liber Augustalis, a code of laws that openly permitted torture for certain crimes. It set out vague conditions. Suspects could be tortured if other evidence was insufficient. But the vagueness was the danger. It meant torture could be applied almost at will. Courts across the Holy Roman Empire copied the model. What had once been exceptional became precedent. By the time Pope Innocent IV gave his blessing 2 decades later, the machinery was ready. The Church's concern was heresy. The Cathars in southern France, who had survived a crusade but not yet been extinguished. Torture became the answer. But the Pope was careful. The actual blood work had to be done by secular authorities. Churchmen would sit in judgment, but soldiers and executioners would carry out the pain. It was a moral sleight of hand, as if the Church could keep its conscience clean by outsourcing its cruelty. Within a few decades, the papal bull had spread like wildfire. By 1260, the Archbishop of Cologne had built a dedicated torture chamber in his palace, complete with instruments and trained staff. In Tillus, inquisitors pursued the remnants of Cathar belief with devices forged for suffering. By 1300, almost every major city in Europe, Paris, Florence, Avignon, Nuremberg, had its own chambers of agony hidden beneath palaces and courts. The practice had become normalized, not just by mobs or rogue rulers, but by statutes, universities, and clerical decrees. But here is where the story turns even darker. Torture was no longer random brutality. It became professionalized. Torturers were trained. Devices were crafted by artisans with the same care a blacksmith might give to a sword or a mason to a cathedral arch. Manuals were written describing the proper. Ways to stretch limbs, apply fire, or use water so that victims would remain conscious, suffering enough to confess, but alive enough to be useful. One Dominican inquisitor, Bernard Guy, recorded in chilling detachment that the limbs crack and separate with such force that the prisoner, in unbearable agony, confesses to crimes he never committed rather than endure such torment. This is the great paradox of the Middle Ages. A society that built soaring cathedrals to the glory of God also built iron racks and crushing boots to rip confessions from human flesh. Scholars debated Aristotle in candlelit halls, while just outside, screams echoed through stone chambers. Faith and cruelty lived side by side, sanctioned by the same institutions. And the justification, it was always the same. Heresy was a disease, they said, like a surgeon cutting away rot to save the body. The inquisitors claimed they were saving souls. Better to destroy the flesh than allow error to spread. It was a chilling logic, one that gave torture a veneer of divine necessity. By the dawn of the 14th century, torture had become embedded not only in law but in culture. People knew it existed. They feared the chamber, the ropes, the coals. They whispered about neighbors who disappeared and returned broken, or who never returned at all. Justice was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about submission. And once submission became the standard of truth, almost anything could be justified. But what exactly were these methods? What instruments did the Middle Ages create to ensure a man would speak what his accusers wanted to hear? As one chronicler put it, the dungeon was a laboratory, and the human body the specimen. The answer lies not just in theory, but in iron and fire, and that is where we go next. The dungeon was not an accident of architecture. It was designed, brick by brick, for a single purpose: to break the human body. As the 13th and 14th centuries unfolded, medieval Europe began constructing an arsenal of devices that turned cruelty into craft. These instruments were not the crude tools of a mob. They were engineered with precision, built by skilled smiths and carpenters who knew exactly how far flesh and bone could bend before they broke. This was not chaos. It was science, medieval science in the service of fear. The most infamous of these devices was the rack, a simple wooden frame, rectangular in shape, with a roller at each end. Ropes tied the victim's wrists to one end, ankles to the other. Then came the turning. Slowly, relentlessly, the rollers twisted, stretching the body past its natural limits. Muscles tore, joints popped, ligaments snapped with a sound like dry branches breaking in a fire. Chroniclers describe prisoners screaming until their voices failed, their bodies elongated grotesquely until they seemed twice their size. One Inquisition record from Carcassonne in 1329 describes how a suspected Cathar sympathizer, Pierre Maury, was stretched until his arms resembled ropes, and his mouth confessed what his heart denied. But the rack was only the beginning. If stretching limbs did not shatter the spirit, there was the strappado. Here, the victim's hands were bound behind his back, then a rope tied to the wrists was thrown over a beam. With a heave, the prisoner was hoisted into the air, dangling by arms twisted unnaturally behind him. The shoulders dislocated almost instantly, but that was only the first agony. Sometimes, weights were tied to the ankles, doubling the strain, threatening to tear the body in two. In Avignon, court records from 1335 describe one accused heretic being raised and dropped repeatedly for hours. Each time he was released, his body would jerk with a sickening pop as bones and ligaments tore anew. Witnesses noted that by the end, his arms hung useless, like sacks of meat, though he was still alive, still conscious, still expected to speak. The ingenuity of medieval torturers did not stop at stretching and tearing. Fire became their ally. Torches and coals were the instruments of choice, not for quick execution but for lingering agony. A common method involved strapping the prisoner into a wooden chair, his bare feet extended over glowing coals. Carefully, the heat was applied, flesh blistering and peeling while the victim writhed in terror. The goal was not death but degradation. In Tilos, a 14th century record tells of Bernard Clare, accused of harboring heretics. His feet were roasted for hours, until the stench of burning flesh filled the chamber, so foul that even the Inquisitor's clerks reportedly gagged. Yet the session continued, with questions shouted between screams. By the end, Clare could no longer walk, but he had spoken. That, to the Inquisitors, was victory. Not every instrument was large or dramatic. Some were small, almost unimpressive to the eye, until they were applied. The thumbscrew, for instance, looked like nothing more than two iron plates with screws attached. But once a victim's fingers or thumbs were placed between the plates, the screws were turned slowly. Bones cracked, flesh tore. Nails split and sometimes popped out entirely. The pain was so sharp, so concentrated, that most prisoners broke within minutes. In Scotland and northern England, the same principle was scaled up. Instead of fingers, it was legs, encased in wooden or iron boots. Wedges were hammered between boot and bone. With each strike, the shins splintered further, until legs were little more than pulp. In one Edinburgh case from 1397, observers reported that fragments of bone fell out when the boots were removed. Then came water. To modern ears it sounds less terrifying, but medieval water torture was as calculated as the rack. Victims were forced to swallow gallon after gallon, far beyond what the body could hold. The stomach swelled grotesquely, pressing against the lungs, creating the sensation of drowning from within. In French courts of the 15th century, records note prisoners forced to drink until they vomited and then made to continue, their bellies so distended they could barely breathe. One victim reportedly consumed nearly 8 gallons before he collapsed, still alive but permanently damaged inside. Each of these devices, rack, strappado, fire, screws, boots, water, reveals something chilling about the medieval mindset. This was not random brutality. It was method. Torturers understood anatomy in practice. If not in theory, they knew how to push the body to its limits without quite killing it. Keeping a victim conscious long enough to extract words, it hardly mattered. Confession was the goal, and confession was always achieved. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the banality. These instruments were not hidden curiosities. They were housed in chambers beneath castles, in cathedrals, in the very palaces of bishops. Professional torturers, sometimes called questioners, were trained like any other trade. They passed down their knowledge, refining techniques, creating a grim continuity from one generation to the next. And ordinary people knew it. They whispered about the rack in Cologne, the boots in Edinburgh, the fires in Toulouse. Torture was not just an event. It was a presence, an unspoken shadow hanging over every accusation, every trial, every rumor of heresy. Yet the dungeon was not the final stage. Torture was only the prelude, the preparation for what came next, the theater of execution. Because in the Middle Ages, pain was not only inflicted in secret chambers, it was performed in public squares, before thousands, in rituals of fire and rope that turned suffering into spectacle. The chamber broke the body. The scaffold broke the soul of the community. And that is where the story now leads. The dungeon had done its work. But the medieval world understood something crucial: private agony was not enough. Terror only reached its full potential when it was public, and so the scaffold was raised, not hidden away in dungeons, but erected in open squares where entire cities could gather. The execution was not merely a punishment, it was theater, a ritual of state power where the condemned became both actor and victim, and the audience, tens of thousands strong, was forced to absorb the lesson. Imagine a marketplace in London or Paris. Stalls closed, bells tolling, people flooding in from villages miles away. Parents carried children on their shoulders so that young eyes would see what happens to those who defied crown or church. Vendors sold roasted nuts and wine as if it were a festival. But the entertainment on display was human suffering. These were not swift deaths designed to bring closure. They were carefully staged spectacles designed to extend fear. The condemned were paraded through the streets before execution, dragged on wooden sledges or made to march barefoot, chained and bleeding. This slow procession allowed the crowd to jeer, spit or pray, depending on their sympathies. Inquisitors called it the journey of shame. To the authorities, it was an essential act of humiliation, ensuring that even before the final moment, the condemned had been transformed from human into symbol. At the scaffold, the theater truly began. Church officials often opened the event with a sermon, declaring that divine justice was about to be served. The condemned might be forced to wear costumes, paper crowns painted with devils, placards listing their crimes, or robes torn to expose their wounds. They were made to confess publicly, warning others not to follow their path. Some did so in broken voices, desperate for absolution. Others, defiant to the end, refused. Their defiance was dangerous, because a prisoner who died with courage could be remembered as a martyr, and martyrs inspired rebellion. That is why executioners were ordered not just to kill, but to destroy the spectacle of resistance. The methods varied, each carrying its own grim symbolism. Hanging was the most common, but unlike modern executions designed for speed, medieval hangings were exercises in slow strangulation. The condemned would swing for 20 minutes or more, kicking, convulsing, gasping for breath, while the crowd watched in fascination. Chroniclers describe faces turning purple, tongues swelling, bodies jerking in their final dance. To the audience, every twitch could be read as a sign repentance, defiance, or damnation. Burning alive was another favorite, especially for heresy. It was chosen not just for its cruelty, but for its symbolism. Fire was seen as cleansing, purifying the soul through pain. Stakes were erected in city squares, surrounded by bundles of kindling stacked high. The condemned were chained to the post as church officials offered one final chance to recant. Some did, hoping for a merciful strangulation before the flames were lit. Others refused, standing tall even as fire licked their feet. The burning of Jerome of Prague in 1416 is among the most recorded. Witnesses described him singing hymns until the smoke choked his voice, lips still moving in prayer even as fire consumed him. The crowd fell silent, struck by his courage. What was meant as a deterrent became inspiration. Beheading was rarer, reserved for nobles and elites. It was considered a privilege, a cleaner death for those of high birth. But even here, theatre mattered. When Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, her death was carefully staged. A French executioner was brought in with a sword rather than an axe, a sign of dignity. Yet the crowd still gathered by the thousands, eager to watch. The strike was swift, but the lesson remained: no rank was high enough to escape the reach of power. Other methods were designed for horror. The breaking wheel, common in Germany, involved strapping victims to a giant cartwheel while executioners shattered their bones with iron clubs, starting from the limbs and working inward. The victim often remained alive, writhing in unbearable pain, while the mangled body was left displayed on the wheel for days as carrion for crows. But perhaps the most notorious was drawing and quartering, reserved for traitors in England. The condemned were dragged through the streets, half hanged to the brink of death, then disemboweled while still conscious. Their intestines were burned before their eyes, their heads severed, and their bodies cut into quarters for display. Guy Fawkes suffered this fate in 1606. Accounts note that he managed to leap from the scaffold before the process began, breaking his neck in a desperate attempt to escape the mutilation that awaited him. Even in failure, his name became legend. To the medieval authorities, these executions were not excesses. They were policy. They were the visual language of power, designed to scar memory as much as flesh. The crowd was not merely witness, but participant. They jeered, threw stones, even fought for relics, scraps of clothing, droplets of blood, or ashes, believing these carried divine or supernatural significance. Children were hoisted up to sea, their earliest memories forever tied to the sight of men and women writhing in flames. Terror was passed from one generation to the next, The scaffold was also a place of unpredictability. Sometimes sympathy erupted. Crowds turned against executioners, shouting prayers or curses at officials. In 1377, in Rouen, so many spectators protested the burning of a popular preacher that soldiers had to be deployed to keep order. In Tyburn, London's infamous execution ground, some prisoners played to the audience, delivering defiant speeches that turned them into folk heroes. Authorities knew this risk, which is why they choreographed every moment so carefully, from the route of the procession to the positioning of soldiers in the crowd. And yet, no matter how brutal, the theater of execution often failed in its ultimate aim. Instead of erasing memory, it created it. Instead of silencing dissent, it inspired songs, poems, whispered legends. Executions meant to crush resistance sometimes gave birth to it. Still, for centuries, this was the heartbeat of medieval justice. The dungeon broke the body. The scaffold broke the spirit. Together, they created a culture where fear was both law and entertainment. But beyond the scaffold and the spectacle lay something even darker: the institutional machinery that made torture systematic. The Inquisition, with its purpose, built chambers, its meticulous records, and its chilling efficiency, elevated cruelty into bureaucracy. And that, more than any execution, revealed the true face of medieval power. Beneath the noise of the scaffold and the cries of the condemned lay something quieter, but far more terrifying: the Inquisition. If public executions were theater, the Inquisition was bureaucracy, a machine of suffering designed not just to kill, but to control. Its chambers did not echo with applause or jeers. They echoed with screams muffled by stone walls built deliberately to contain them. In the papal palace at Avignon, records show entire basements restructured into purpose, built torture chambers. These were not improvised dungeons, but facilities engineered for efficiency. Stone walls thick enough to trap sound, drains carved into the floor for blood and waste, and racks of instruments catalogued like a surgeon's tools. The Inquisition was not content to merely frighten people. It sought to industrialize pain, to transform cruelty into procedure. The case files read like ledgers of horror. In Carcassonne, between 1249 and 1350, thousands of names were recorded with precision's age, accusation, confession, sentence. Each entry detailed not only the crime, but the technique used to secure admission. The rack, the strappado, the brazier. Torture was no longer the chaotic whim of a sadistic guard. It was policy carried out with legal sanction and bureaucratic oversight. The strappado was among the most frequently used. Victims' hands were bound behind their backs, a rope looped around their wrists, and they were hoisted upward until their shoulders dislocated with an audible snap. Sometimes weights were tied to their feet, intensifying the tearing agony. In Avignon in 1335, one man was raised and dropped repeatedly for 4 hours. By the end, his arms hung useless at his sides, his body broken, but his confession carefully recorded. The Inquisition also understood psychology. They didn't always need fire or steel. Sometimes they used silence, darkness, and fear. Prisoners were locked in cells so small they could not stand upright, left in perpetual twilight, deprived of sleep as guards woke them every few hours. Inquisitors whispered that their loved ones had already confessed, that resistance was futile. Others were forced to hear the screams of their children or spouses in adjacent chambers, breaking their will without a finger being laid on them. Beatrice de Planisol, a widow accused in Toulouse in 1320, endured this. The records reveal she did not scream when questioned, nor did she break under the strappado. But when she heard the voices of her daughters in nearby cells, their cries of pain, their begging for mercy, she collapsed. Her testimony flowed freely after that. The Inquisition had discovered that a parent's love could be as exploitable as any joint or bone. This system reached its peak in Monteleu, a small Pyrenean village investigated by Inquisitor Jacques Fournier between 1318 and 1325. Fournier, who would later ascend to the papacy as Benedict XVI, oversaw one of the most detailed investigations in history. Nearly the entire adult population was interrogated. Husbands betrayed wives, parents accused children, neighbors turned on neighbors. The village dissolved into a web of suspicion and fear, its social fabric shredded. By the time the investigation ended, Montelu was a ghost of itself, proof that the Inquisition's reach extended beyond the individual to poison entire communities. What made the Inquisition so dangerous was its marriage of faith and law. Torture was framed as divine justice, as a necessary purging of heresy to save souls. Inquisitors claimed they were not harming bodies, only correcting beliefs. They cited the papal bull ad extirpanda, which insisted torture should cause no loss of life or limb. But in practice, this was a hollow phrase. Executioners had mastered the art of inflicting agony without immediate death. Dislocated shoulders, crushed fingers, roasted feet. Victims lived long enough to confess, which was all the system required. The Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, codified even harsher practices as the Inquisition shifted focus from heresy to witchcraft. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, insisted that witches possessed supernatural resistance to pain, and therefore torture had to be even more severe to break them. This doctrine gave torturers unlimited license to escalate brutality, convinced that the more a victim resisted, the more proof it was of guilt. The cruelty was not confined to physical suffering. Torture was woven into a ritual of humiliation. Accused women were stripped and shaved, their hair and body searched for witch marks. Nakedness itself became a weapon, a stripping away not only of modesty but of humanity. Victims were paraded before inquisitors as objects, degraded before pain even began. And all of this, every dislocation, every scream, every false confession, was meticulously recorded. Parchment filled with careful handwriting preserved the details, dates, names, instruments used, words spoken. The Inquisition was obsessed with documentation. To them, each confession was not only evidence but vindication. They believed the paperwork proved that torture worked, that the system was just, that God himself sanctioned the screams echoing in those stone chambers. What makes this chapter of history so chilling is not just the cruelty itself, but its normalization. Entire institutions were dedicated to suffering. Artisans built instruments designed to crush skulls or tear ligaments. Priests blessed torture chambers before sessions began. Communities accepted that their neighbors might vanish into the dungeon, never to emerge, and they learned not to ask questions. The machinery of the Inquisition functioned precisely because it became ordinary. And yet, the brutality backfired. Every system of repression eventually creates martyrs. Every scream echoes longer than intended. The Inquisition believed it was stamping out heresy, but in truth, it was writing legends, stories of those who endured the rack without betraying their faith, or who sang hymns even as fire consumed them, spread farther than fear. The very cruelty designed to preserve the authority of church and crown instead revealed their fragility. Still, for centuries, the Inquisition's machinery ground on, not hidden in shadows, but sanctioned, blessed, and recorded. And as secular rulers saw its effectiveness, they borrowed its methods. Royal courts across Europe built their own chambers, their own racks, their own bureaucracies of pain. The scaffold had been theater. The Inquisition had been machinery. But when kings and emperors adopted torture into their courts, cruelty itself became law. And that would lead to punishment so elaborate, so grotesque, that even the medieval world would eventually recoil. By the late Middle Ages, the line between church and crown blurred into something darker. What had begun as the Inquisition's machinery of faith soon spilled into the courts of kings, queens, and emperors. Secular rulers saw how torture could silence dissent, extract confessions, and display power, and they wanted it for themselves. With terrifying speed, cruelty migrated from cathedral basements into royal palaces and city halls. Torture became not just a weapon of religion, but of the state. France was one of the earliest adopters. Philip IV, known as the Fair, recognized that pain could be as effective as armies. In 1301, he ordered the arrest of high-ranking clergymen who opposed his authority. Their interrogation in the Louvre Palace followed inquisitorial procedures exactly racks, strappado, burning coals. The symbolism was chilling. Even bishops could be broken beneath the crown's authority. Justice was no longer about truth. It was about demonstrating that resistance was futile. In England, the Tower of London became a laboratory of pain. Beneath its thick stone walls, imported devices from the continent joined locally built contraptions. Suspected traitors, rebels, and conspirators were brought here, where instruments like the rack and the scavenger's daughter became infamous. Unlike the rack, which stretched bodies until joints tore apart, the scavenger's daughter compressed them into grotesque shapes. Prisoners were forced into crouched positions, knees to chest, arms bound tight. Iron bands squeezed until blood burst from noses, ears, and fingernails. Victims sometimes emerged paralyzed or broken beyond recognition, yet technically alive, fulfilling the legal fiction that torture did not kill. Germany went further. In cities like Nuremberg, torture chambers became permanent institutions, staffed by professional executioners who doubled as torturers. Their craft was passed down like a family trade. Manuals described the precise limits of human endurance, how much pressure a joint could take, how far ligaments could stretch, how long the body could survive without water. These men were not improvising. They were technicians of agony. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV's Golden Bull of 1356 codified this system, explicitly authorizing torture in serious cases. With imperial sanction, cruelty was no longer an aberration, it was law. Italy, fractured into city-states, developed its own refinements. Venice, with its shadowy canals and secret councils, specialized in water-based tortures. Suspects were subjected to controlled drowning sessions, their heads forced into vats of seawater or brine, lungs burning as interrogators timed their near death with precision. Florence, under the Medici, perfected psychological torture alongside physical. Political enemies were not just beaten or stretched. They were isolated, interrogated relentlessly, and shown fabricated evidence of betrayal by friends or family. The message was clear: nothing was more terrifying than the machinery of the state. Spain, though later associated with its notorious Inquisition, also wove torture deeply into its secular governance. Spanish courts experimented with variations of the iron boot, devices that encased legs in iron casings, tightened with wedges until bones shattered. Witnesses described fragments of bone falling out when boots were finally removed. The horror of this spectacle was magnified by its public nature. Crowds were invited to hear the sound of hammer strikes, to see the agony firsthand. The executioner's mallet was as much a political tool as it was an instrument of pain. Perhaps the most infamous symbol of secular cruelty was the breaking wheel. First documented in German territories in the 14th century, it became a favorite across Europe for punishing criminals deemed beyond redemption. Victims were tied to a massive wooden wheel raised high in public squares. Executioners wielding iron bars smashed bones methodically, starting with legs and arms before moving inward toward vital organs. Each blow was calculated to prolong life, to ensure screams echoed across the city. Sometimes, victims survived for hours, even days, strapped to the wheel as crows and dogs picked at their exposed wounds. These punishments were not just about killing. They were about spectacle. In Paris, London, Nuremberg, Florence, Venice, crowds gathered by the thousands, turning execution into theater. Vendors sold food. Children sat on shoulders to get a better view. The condemned played their parts, confessing or begging for mercy while priests sermonized and officials proclaimed justice. Pain was not hidden in shadows. It was flaunted in the sunlight, framed as moral instruction. But beneath this carnival of cruelty lay cold calculation. Monarchs and magistrates understood that torture was not only about the condemned, it was about everyone watching. Every groan, every bone crack, every plume of smoke from burning flesh carried a message: resist the crown, and this will be you. Secular torture was less about extracting truth than about creating obedience. The professionalization of torture created chilling efficiencies. Executioners formed guilds in some cities, teaching apprentices the correct application of pain, sharing innovations in devices, even standardizing rituals. A macabre science developed. Ironmongers forged new tools, spiked chairs that tore flesh, vises that crushed skulls, collars lined with inward, facing spikes that cut each time the prisoner swallowed. Craftsmanship was devoted not to beauty or function, but to suffering. Yet cruelty always breeds resistance. Stories began to circulate of those who endured unimaginable agony without betraying their cause. Martyrs emerged not only from religious persecution, but from secular brutality. In Scotland, nobles captured during Edward I's campaigns were tortured in the Tower of London, but their silence turned them into legends of defiance. In France, peasants executed on the wheel were remembered as heroes of resistance against oppressive lords. Every scream recorded by authorities echoed later as defiance in ballads and whispered tales. The paradox grew sharper with time. The very punishments meant to intimidate began to inspire. Breaking wheels became symbols of tyranny rather than justice. Racks and boots, once feared, became reminders of regimes that ruled by cruelty alone. By the late 15th century, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Enlightenment thinkers would eventually seize on these contradictions, asking whether torture truly served justice or simply corrupted it. But in the Middle Ages, in the centuries before reform, cruelty remained the order of the day. Secular rulers had transformed torture from ritual to law, from church-sanctioned purification to state-sanctioned governance. Across Europe, from the glittering palaces of monarchs to the cobblestones of village squares, one truth became clear: pain was power, and rulers wielded it with a precision as sharp as any blade.